Hey everyone, today I'm going to share with you the things I always keep in mind when I master my tracks. Mastering can be as in-depth as you want it to be because there's really no limit to the amount of possibilities, but today we're just going to take a look at the essentials. I highly recommend importing a track of your choice into your mastering session so that you can have a side-by-side comparison to a mastered song. This will give you some insight on whether or not your tracks compete with other professional records, which is one of the most important tasks of a mastering engineer. It also helps with knowing if you're actually enhancing your record or if you're just changing it. We all know it can be hard to tell sometimes. Rather than using a reference track, I like to simply compare my new changes to my original pre-master, so that's what I did here. Now let's get to the processing chain. We're going to stick to all stock Logic plugins so everyone can use this info to start mastering their own tracks. So with that said, I like to use the stereo spread, MultiPresser, linear EQ, limiter, and Multimeter, in that order. This is a great place to start depending on the needs of your track you're mastering, but it may need more and it may even need less. Now let's just start with our spread plugin. This is something you want to use carefully because what you hear from your speakers may be entirely different than when you put your headphones on. The last thing you want is for your track to sound louder on one side than the other. My rule of thumb for this plugin is to keep it between about 1K and under 20K, and then never go above about 20%, especially if you apply it directly on the channel like I did here. So let's experiment with it and see if it's an appropriate tool for this track. Just remember that this is always more extreme in headphones. You can already begin to hear some of the problems that occur if you go too low. Now it should almost be hard to tell a difference, so let's just stick with that for now. Moving on to the multipressor. I like to think of this as a compressor that has an EQ. Wherever you have these frequency ranges set, any sound within that frequency range will be affected by the compressor. You'll also be able to see the amount of gain being added or taken away by the compression, and you can then boost or cut to compensate. I like to solo each band that I'm working on so that I can hear the changes I'm making, and then sometimes I'll bypass and unbypass. Now let's play around with it. Here we have very little happening, but that's kind of the idea. Now this is where our original track comes in handy. Did we enhance the sound or did we just make a random change? So we just hold Option and click Solo to switch between the two. I like the new one, it sounds a little more punchy. So next is our EQ. It's common practice to use a linear phase EQ when mastering because a normal EQ can result in some phase cancellations when you translate over to a mono speaker system. Now I always start by cutting out the low end because the low frequencies take the most energy to produce, so why waste that energy on frequencies that you can't even hear? I'll usually cut it about 25-ish with a steep curve. And then same for the top. Now it's really important not to make any big changes to an EQ when mastering, so my rule of thumb is usually no more than about 2.5 dB. And when I EQ, I always boost and sweep. This way I can hear what I'm changing. So let's do some EQing. Here sounds a little bit boxy, so let's just cut maybe 1.5 dB out. The same usually happens around this area, 1 to 200-ish. It's kind of unpleasant to the ears. Let's make our Q a little bit wider, and we'll leave it at about negative 1.9 dB. Now let's hear a before and after to make sure it was a good change. Sounds a little bit more tightened up now. Keep in mind, you always want to make a habit of checking your stereo output to make sure that your signal isn't too hot, in which case it's not right now. So next is our limiter. And this is my favorite because it's where you make the track loud. You just don't want to push it too hard or else your track will start to lose its dynamics. So your output level right here sets the wall that no sound should ever exceed. So I like to set that just under 0 dB because occasionally a sound can exceed the wall if it's pushed hard enough. I found that for hip-hop tracks, I really like a quick release, but this is personal preference, so feel free to explore the possibilities. Every track is different, so let's get this thing louder. Now we see that my snare is cutting in a little hard, so we can go back to maybe the MultiPresser and turn this down just a tad bit. Now last but not least, we have the multimeter. Now the main thing I really use this for is the phase correlation meter down here. This will ensure that no problems will occur when listening on mono systems like we talked about earlier. So you usually want this meter to be floating to the right, but it can go as far as the middle and still be okay. If it goes anywhere to the left, in the red, you may have a phasing issue, which means some sounds are getting canceled out. So let's check that real quick. Looks pretty good. So there you have it, the essentials for mastering your own tracks.